Hello, and thank you again for coming along. Today we're going to consider part two of African food crises and the unraveling of the global food system. You'll remember that previously we dealt with Tigray and the age-old narrative of catastrophe in part one. Today we're going to look at part two, extractive colonialism and billionaire agribusiness. These are basically two different narratives being put forward for what's happening in a very tragic way on a large scale in Ethiopia at this point, in the Tigrayan region of Ethiopia. One of these narratives is to suggest that there's been age-old catastrophe once again. We're seeing it unfold. There's been famine before, there'll be famine again, and this will always be a repeating cycle. But in part two, we're going to look at a different explanatory framework, one that looks more at the history of the evolution of agriculture in this part of Ethiopia, but also elsewhere in Ethiopia and elsewhere in Africa. These histories of African agriculture have been tied up with a history of extractive colonialism on the part of several different colonial powers and continued in our day by billionaire agribusiness firms. That's what we're going to look at in greater detail here. We were told back last June that there was going to be a looming tragedy in Tigray, and that it was avoidable if we could act fast enough as an international community. Tigray is this part of Ethiopia, right up on the border with Eritrea, and bordering on the west with the Sudan. You remember, you can see part one of this series in transition studies. In fact, you can always review prior programs in transition studies just by clicking on that and looking for the title in the search engine. We dealt with part one in the prior program. We emphasized that the tragedy was being reported internationally by the BBC and others. The State Department was quite concerned about it. In fact, sent a whole series of people who made statements from the State Department in Washington, D.C. back in early August, and they sent out their highest diplomats to talk with the Ethiopian president and other representatives from the Tigray area. They realized that over 1.7 million Tigrayans have been displaced within the region since last November, and more than 46,000 have sought refuge in neighboring Sudan. So this became very quickly an international crisis. You can see the Tigray region is bordered by Sudan in the west, and it's those areas that have received now 46,000 and counting, a larger number now, of migrants across international borders because of the crisis in Tigray. On the Ethiopian border, refugees were fleeing the fighting and famine and making for the Sudan. But we need to understand that Tigray is not the only region in Ethiopia to have problems over food and farming. There have been long-standing and large-scale problems elsewhere in Ethiopia. Consider, for example, the famous land rush in the Gambela region that drew international attention not long ago. It's this larger context that we want to understand as a continuum for what we are now witnessing. So we're focusing now on this part two, extractive colonialism and billionaire agribusiness. John Vidal, the environmental reporter for The Guardian in London, published an important story that helps us understand the larger picture of the conflict in rural Ethiopia. It was entitled Ethiopia Land Rush, Feed the World, but Not Themselves. Let's listen to his account of the Ethiopia's land rush.
This is Ethiopia, one of the hungriest countries in the world. But here, foreign companies are spending billions of dollars to grow food for export. An area the size of Britain has been handed over to corporations in the last 3 years. It's called a land rush. I'm in Ethiopia's remote southwest Gambela region to investigate claims that large numbers of small farmers are being moved off their land by the government. Now, all this land for the next hour of our driving is going to be some kind of farming, intensive industrial agriculture. We're driving west through Karaturi Farm, a new Indian venture, where large areas of forest are already being cleared to grow palm oil, rice and sugar. Are you going there? Hello. Hello. It will be one of the largest farms in Africa, but most of the food will be exported. Populations are growing, so this has to be good for the world. But what about Ethiopia's poor? The man in charge is Kamjit Shekon. So how big will this whole farm be?
Phase 1, 100,000 hectares.
After that?
After the second phase, 100,000 plus 200,000.
So 300,000 hectares. And if I started walking at one end, how long would it take me to get to the other end?
On 100,000 hectares is about 121 kilometers.
120 kilometers, that's 80, 90 miles.
90 miles.
That's big.
Yeah.
It's as big as Wales. So will you plant, will you build a town just by here?
Yes, do you see those trees?
Yes.
There will be the town, next camp coming up.
So that would be Camp 2 and that would be 10,000 people?
Maybe 10 to 15,000.
Karaturi says it will build home schools and clinics for as many as 60,000 workers. But on one of their other Ethiopian farms, similar promises made by the government have yet to be fulfilled. In addition, we found they pay most workers under $1 a day. That's well below what the World Bank says is extreme poverty. I think that because you were the first people here, you've got the best land. I think you've got the river access.
We never saw the land.
Yeah? Oh, you never saw it?
They gave it to us, we took it.
Seriously?
Seriously.
You did not even see it?
Yes.
They offered it to you?
They offered, that's all.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Razak.
This has to be the deal of the century. 1,000 square miles for just £150 a week. Plus, they get tax breaks and roads built for them by the government. Now, presumably, all the trees, all the forests which we see at the moment will have to come down, so you can plant them.
Yes.
Is that inevitable, or is that just...
It's inevitable.
Yeah,
You have to clear this.
Yeah.
Then there has to be a road network for harvesting.
So it's very mechanized, it's very industrialized, it's very precise. Karaturi says their land was sparsely populated and denied displacing local villagers. On the way back to Gambela town, we passed a group of shacks along the side of the road, near where other foreign companies are moving in. This is Kami village, which we think is full of displaced people, but we'll see. Well, these people clearly haven't been here for very long. These are very rudimentary tents. Around 250 people have been living here for 8 months. Chief, thank you so much for talking to me. Thank you very much indeed. Are most of the people here displaced from other areas? Why did they have to move?
በፈላጎት ነው። ለምሳሌ መንግስት መጀመሪያ ቀስቀሳ ሲናደርገል ዳኛው በፈላጎት ጥሩ ነገር እንዲሰሩልን አሁን በየቦታ ተበታተነው ነው ያለው።
The government moved these people and told them they would get a health clinic, a school, as well as fresh drinking water. So far, only the foundations have been dug. Okay, these people are pastoralists. They're quite used to moving backwards and forwards across land. What they don't realise is this land may be taken away from them forever. That would be very different for them. I'm going to the state government to find out how many companies have come to Gambela. Hello. And we want to know how many people will be affected by the land rush. We've got 3 maps here in the investment office. This is the extraordinary map because it shows that for the last for 10 years, 12 years, has been just about nothing. In 2007, it started going right up. Since then, there have been hundreds, and I've just been told that the total number of investors in Gambella region is 896. Now, that is an extraordinary figure from absolutely nothing only 10 years ago. Kasahun Zefu is one of the department's senior officials. What countries are they coming from?
India, Saudi Arabia, and China, and so forth.
Can you explain why you are relocating villages?
We relocate villagers to obtain clean water in one place, to obtain medical services.
So the two things are very separate. One is the relocation, the deliberate relocation of villages,
Yeah.
and the second thing is the investment by the foreigners, and the two have no link whatever.
There is no link. Yeah.
So it's a coincidence.
Yeah.
That the
Yeah.
villagers are relocating.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So the villagers, when they relocate, can they go back to their land?
No.
They can't go back to their land.
Yeah.
So
It
who
is
takes
it
the
is
land?
voluntary relocation.
It's all voluntary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
why.
Kasahun said as many as 15,000 people are being moved, but at the same time, thousands of square miles is being cleared. Great swathes of Gambella are being ecologically devastated. Carbon emissions will rise and wildlife will vanish. I had been told about a village not far from the Karature farm that had been cleared just weeks ago. Actually, the whole of this was the village. So it's not just a few houses which we see left there. All of this was actually a village pretty recently. There's nothing left, they've all gone. And they've left the storage pots. We don't know the name of the village, but we do know that people were here about 5 months ago. Gambella is up for grabs, and foreign investors are not the only ones moving into the region. Wealthy Ethiopians from other parts of the country are also leasing huge areas of land. Okay, we've just stopped the car because we found a small group of people who may have something to say about the burning down of this forest. Many of the villagers we met were too scared to talk to us about what was happening. But one man was willing to speak on condition we disguised his identity. Have you tried to stop the bulldozers? Have you tried to stop them setting fire to the ground? The farmer told me he didn't want to move to a resettlement village. Will they have to forcibly evict you? The man was frightened of being beaten up by soldiers. Some farmers have reportedly disappeared or been killed for speaking out against the government. Do you think you're in danger? Later that day, we returned to Addis Ababa. Ethiopia's government is desperate for development and jobs for its growing population, and you can understand why it wants to attract foreign investment to a country that can't grow enough food for itself. But I still wasn't sure if the land rush in Gambella was in the people's best interests. I put what we'd seen in Gambella to the Minister for Agriculture, Wanda Radmandefro. Minister, when we were down there, we saw a lot of evidence of people having to move because of the investors moving into the area. Can you confirm that, please?
By the way, there is no movement of population.
Minister, with respect, we found many villagers who were frightened, who were worried, who had been told that they would have to move.
It's their choice, either to choose to have these basic services coming to the village, therefore it's based on their willingness. But of course, you know, they have to abandon their previous way of life. You cannot provide any basic services having highly scattered community.
So you have 3 million people, 2.9 million, 2.8 million, who this year will receive food aid from America, from Europe, from wherever, at the same time as you are trying to export large amounts of food and commodities to America and other countries. Is this not sort of rather complete madness?
You said madness, but it is not madness, and it's the correct way.
The government is saying that Ethiopia's poor will only become less reliant on aid if they give up their old way of life, and that large-scale industrial farming in places like Gambella is not just the future, but a development necessity.
We've just come out from the minister, and clearly he's hoping for an enormous increase in productivity in farming in Ethiopia. The danger, clearly, is that the companies take advantage of this, that they will grow what they want to grow, and they will sell it to whom they want to sell it, and the real benefit for Ethiopia will never be seen at all. And the real danger for Ethiopia is that they will have given away their land for next to nothing.
As he phrased it in the title, Ethiopia's land rush, feed the world, but not themselves. Now that's a very interesting formulation of it. Who is feeding the world and who are themselves? Is it the Ethiopian government, the Ethiopian people? Well, what's happening behind all of this is something to look at in detail, and it has to do with the profiteering of multinational corporations rushing for land, grabbing land from within Africa to produce food, not for the African populations, but for export and for profit on a global scale in a global food system. Furthermore, famine is spreading in South Sudan at this point. Not only people are migrating into northern Sudan or Sudan country proper from Tigray, but in South Sudan, which got its independence 10 years ago, we're told that 7 million people are at risk of famine. Let's take
In the east of South Sudan, the sun burns down on Gumuruk, and with the constant threat of violence, farming is impossible. There are many villages like this in the country, both victims of and participants in communal conflicts. A few weeks ago, Gumuruk came under attack by neighboring tribes. They burned food aid, vehicles, everything in their path. For the second time in 2 years, Jacob Aria Ngama lost his little market stall.
All around here there were stalls, but the attackers came and they burned everything.
Jacob is a member of the Murle tribe and says he's never seen so much violence.
Before the independence, we the Murle were not attacked. There was a coexisting peace between the communities. Now the attacks are frequent. There are many killed. Women and children are kidnapped too.
The same ethnic violence is destabilizing the whole country. NGOs try to bring back stability by bringing together the fighting tribes, the Dinka, the Nuer, and the Murle.
We were able to make peace this year. We set up rules and ended the conflict. But despite all of that, the Murle attacked us and killed some of our own 12 times. We're tired of seeing Murle and Nuer victims. When we come here, we can see that Murle don't have hospitals, don't have schools, and don't have water. And we don't have any of that either.
The fighting between communities is often really cattle rustling, and the raids are to blame for 78% of the victims of violence, says the UN.
Before the separation with Khartoum, intercommunal conflict was not as massive as it is now because we were focusing on the common enemy, which at the time was Khartoum. Now that South Sudan is independent, communities have turned against each other for food.
The country's independence came in 2011, after decades of fighting, and with the help of the United States. But new divisions quickly appeared in the new country.
The reason of conflict were all to do with the power struggle. A certain group of officers within the Sudan People Liberation Army, led by Dr. Riek Machar, the first vice president, thought to take power by force. And that led into the civil war.
Riek Machar denies wanting to take over the country. Still, a power struggle between the vice president and President Salva Kiir did spark a civil war that lasted 6 years, coming to an official end with a peace deal in 2018. But outside Juba, the fighting continues. The worst situation is in the Pibor administrative area in the east. Because there's been lots of violence and no harvest, people are facing famine. Food is brought in by helicopters. Sometimes it's dropped from a passing plane. People then get a bit of hope back, but some, like this young mother, don't eat for days because of the recent attacks.
I'm very happy that this food is reaching us. It'll help me feed my child.
In these faraway regions, bringing in the aid is a logistical challenge.
In the rainy season, the little roads that are available, most of them are dirt roads, become impassable. And so WFP has to fly, such as what you see on my left right now, to fly the food and the assistance that is needed to keep communities alive. There is more than 60% of South Sudanese people who are extremely food insecure. This means they are growingly becoming hungry, unable to provide food for themselves and for their loved ones.
Many children here suffer from severe malnutrition. Chacha Korok Mere, who lost her husband and cattle when men from a nearby village came on a raid, now survives by gathering wild fruit.
I have nothing to sustain my child's life. My life was better before the independence. There was no attack. Cattle were not raided. And my husband was still here.
Here, the community survives almost entirely thanks to international aid.
This food gives me a little reprieve, but I'm always afraid. The attacks can start at any time, and I'll have to run away and throw away the food. And if by some miracle I survive, I won't have anything to eat.
10 years after independence, more than 7 million South Sudanese are in a state of grave food insecurity. The World Food Programme says a third of the children can't get enough to eat.
So, these are not just problems in Ethiopia. They're problems in both the Tigray area and the Gambela region, starting many years ago. And they're spilling over now into South Sudan, where refugees from the Gambela region have moved, and South Sudan has its own economic problems. Food, famine, and destruction in civil wars are what is driving these processes. All of this is occurring in Ethiopia and the Sudan, while the UN is convening a food systems summit in Rome. The Food Systems Summit had a pre-summit official ceremony and global town hall, Rising Up to the Future, it was entitled. It's very interesting to look at this pre-summit, the exchange in a town hall between experts and panelists. Panelists were presumed to be experts, but some people spoke up from the audience in this pre-summit because they didn't have any official status. They weren't representing particular countries or UN agencies that convened it. There was a town hall, they call it, a global town hall, Rising Up to the Future. Well, it's very interesting to see what happened at that global town hall. In particular, particular American economist, not known for his criticism of the global food system until now, made a very stinging attack on the whole notion of a world food system. As the headlines caught it, eminent American economist Jeffrey Sachs exposes the truth about how the West is keeping Africa poor. Now, this is broadcast on Africa Web TV, and it's worth looking at in detail. Both the broadcast itself and the vehicle through which it was transmitted, Africa Web TV, because a whole group of people watch that don't read the Western press usually. Let's listen.
Thank you very much. What we've been hearing is how the system actually works right now. And I want to emphasize we have a world food system. It's based on large multinational companies. It's based on private profits. It's based on a very, very low measure of international transfers to help poor people, sometimes none at all. It's based on extreme irresponsibility of powerful countries with regard to the environment. And it's based on a radical denial of rights of poor people, as we just heard. It's interesting, we heard from the Minister of DRC, what's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years. The government of Belgium ran the slave colony for another 40 years. The CIA assassinated your first popular leader, Mr. Lumumba, and then installed another dictatorship for the next 30 years. And then Glencore and others now suck out your cobalt without giving you tax income. We don't reflect on that. We say, what's wrong with you? Why don't you govern properly? And so we have a system, but we need a different system. We cannot turn this over to the private sector. We already did about 100 years ago. Not only to the private sector with the US military behind it, with the defense of these property rights in the Minister of Honduras's country, where United Fruit ran the country for a long time. And their attorney was the foreign minister of the United States, Secretary Dulles, and his brother was the head of the CIA and overthrew the next door neighbor, Mr. Arbenz, to make sure that United Fruit could have its property. So we have a system, but we need a different system. And the different system has to be based on principles of human dignity in the Universal Declaration, principles of sovereignty, principles of economic rights, because these are not nice things to do. In 1948, all the government said that food is a right, social protection is a right, not a nice thing, not a pleasant thing, a right. That was 73 years ago. The SDGs are nothing more than our generation's attempt to honor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I come from a country that not only doesn't care about the world's poor, it doesn't even care about its own poor. 1 in 7 Americans is hungry right now. And they don't care. I mean, the poor people care, but one political party, all it cares about is cutting taxes for the rich and filibustering any solution. So we're in a world that's really tough. The private sector's not going to solve this problem. I'm sorry to say to all of the private sector leaders, behave, pay your taxes, follow the rules. That's what you should do. And what the governments should do is the following. They won't, but they should. First, the G20 should become the G21 by inviting systemically the chairperson of the African Union and the African Union to be the 21st country. The European Union is a member of the G20 as the EU. If you add the AU as the 21st for the G21, you add 1.4 billion people to representation at that crucial event. That will change decisively the discussion, because 1.4 billion people are not at the table for finance right now, and they need to be. So my first recommendation is the G21. I love the G20. Add one seat, 1.4 billion people with the AU represented. Second, we need an order of magnitude change of development finance. The rich countries just borrowed $17 trillion for COVID. The poor countries, nothing. Because the rich countries can borrow at 0, and the poor countries pay 5 or 10% coupon rates or have no access at all. So the world exposed its grotesque inequality this past year and a half. Rich countries didn't say, we tighten our belts, why don't you? My country spent $7 trillion of emergency funding, not one penny for anybody else, by the way. $7 trillion, it didn't even cross the imagination of the US Congress to include a few crumbs for the rest of the world. But the poor countries cannot borrow. That's what we should have heard from the World Bank. I didn't hear that from the World Bank. I didn't hear real numbers. Real numbers are in trillions right now because the world economy is 100 trillion a year. But we don't talk about real numbers. But my job, all I know in this world is long division. Divide by 100 trillion and then see whether you're talking about something real or not. So that's the second thing. We need massively to increase the lending and borrowing capacity of poor countries at near 0 interest rates like the rich countries have. Then they could get something done. By the way, for COVID vaccines, what we really need is for the United States to sit down with China, with Russia, with the European Union and the UK one day around the table and allocate these vaccines rather than hoarding them. That's all it would take. And then we're going to have national pathways. This is a wonderful idea, but they're going to need financing. And so everything that I've been saying, I know the numbers. That's all I do for 40 years is add up what's missing. You want electricity? It has to be purchased. You want digital access? It has to be purchased. You want safe water irrigation? It has to be purchased. This is what I do for a living, is add up these numbers and then find out that then somebody makes up something and names 1/100th of what's really needed. It's not even hard. By the way, the IMF has done wonderful studies in the last 2 years showing that we have a financing gap of about $400 to $500 billion a year for the basics for the SDGs. They show the gap, but nobody comes up with the number, the solution, which wouldn't be so hard because that's just not a big number. It's 0.5 of 1% of world output. So if we really care, we wouldn't have the G7 saying, we love education, therefore we're going to give $3 billion for education. That's what they said at the summit. But what UNESCO has shown is that you need at least $30 billion a year, minimum. But nobody looks at numbers. They just make up nice check the box. So we need the real numbers of finance to back the national pathways. The final thing is we need the UN as the core and central institution of this world, period. Because this is the only way we're going to have a civilized world, is a strong UN. And it cannot be that the whole UN budget is less than my neighborhood's budget in New York. The UN core budget this year is $3 billion. New York City's budget is $100 billion. And then we say, why don't things work well? Because the rich are hoarding everything. Final point, rather than our 3 billionaires going in space, well, they could go into space and stay there and leave their money behind. That would be one idea. But another idea is we have 2,775 billionaires on the current list. Their combined net worth, 2,700, is $13.1 trillion. Now, I have it on good authority, you don't need more than $1 billion to be comfortable. But they have an excess of $11 trillion over just the $1 billion. So we should be taxing that and having a civilized world. Thank you.
Jeffrey Sachs.
Well, he says thank you at the end, but you can tell what an extraordinary intervention this was from the floor in this town meeting. In fact, it's very important. It was carried on Africa Web TV because a lot of people listen to Africa Web TV that aren't in these meetings. And in fact, that was part of his point. Anybody with a cell phone in Africa could hear what he said, and you can bet that it was retransmitted and linked to one after another of the recipients around the continent. Some of it may find it amusing, but the seriousness, especially among college and university students, was very clear. What they're laughing at is the way in which it took everyone else by surprise on the panel that were supposed to be the experts. Take a look then. Once again, you can find this on Transition Studies as a transmission and listen to it carefully. There are pressing food crises in Ethiopia and southern Sudan at this point, South Sudan, the new country, and they concentrated in the Tigray area as well as the Gambela region. But these crises underscore the fragility and, in fact, the coming collapse, the continuing collapse of a world food system, something underscored by Jeffrey Sachs. We need to rethink not only African agriculture, but the global food system.